Welcome. You're listening to Detective Duo, bringing you tales from the golden age of mystery, adventures in the spirit of Tommy and Tuppence Beresford. Tap subscribe to stay with us and share where in the world you're listening from. It began, as many of their adventures did, with something half ordinary and half absurd. In this case, Tuppence deciding that the sitting room fireplace was a disgrace to civilization. Tommy, who had been reading the Times with one ankle resting comfortably on the armchair, looked up as a cascade of ashes tumbled onto the rug. "If civilization depends on clean grates, we're doomed," he remarked mildly. "Don't be idiotic," said Tuppence, brandishing the poker like a sword. "There's nothing so demoralizing as neglect. I can't think why we ever let the charwoman stuff everything into the grate instead of the dustbin." She poked once more and gave a satisfied "ah" as something white fluttered out of the grey. It was the corner of an envelope, scorched, curled, and stubbornly refusing to vanish among the ashes. Tuppence bent to pick it up. The flap was half melted, and the paper smelled faintly of perfume, violet, unmistakable and lingering like memory. "Tommy," she said, her tone abruptly serious, "this wasn't yesterday's rubbish. Look." He leaned over, reading aloud the portion that had survived the fire. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, distinctly feminine. "If you destroy this, it will destroy you." Tommy whistled softly. "Dramatic. Rather reminds one of the cinema serials. What do you suppose it means?" "It means," said Tuppence, "that someone in this household has been playing with fire. Literally." "You flatter yourself," he said cheerfully. "We haven't any dark secrets to be destroyed." Tuppence was not listening. She turned the envelope in her fingers, frowning. "Do you smell it? Violet scent. Not cheap either. Denham's violet essence, if I'm not mistaken. Mrs. Denham wore it when we dined at Witchmere Court last month. It's the sort of scent that makes an entrance before its owner does." Tommy groaned. "Oh no. We're not starting a new case over somebody's choice of perfume." She gave him a look that would have silenced a platoon. "Perfume, my dear Thomas, has solved more crimes than fingerprints." "Perhaps," he murmured, "but not usually before breakfast." Ignoring him, she examined the charred paper again. The letter had been burned hastily. The edges were uneven, the ink blurred but still legible in places. The signature had gone, but a single phrase above the warning line survived. "You promised me once." Tuppence's eyes sharpened. "You see, this wasn't a prank. Someone wrote this in desperation." Tommy folded his paper and sighed. "Suppose we assume it's genuine. How did it end up in our grate?" "That," said Tuppence, "is precisely what I intend to find out." Her tone had that particular mixture of curiosity and righteous indignation that Tommy recognized as the herald of trouble. He leaned back and waited for the inevitable storm of deduction. "First," she said, pacing to the window, "no one except ourselves, Albert, and Mrs. Lockett the cleaner have access to this flat. Second, I never saw this letter before. Third, the fire hasn't been lit since yesterday afternoon. Therefore, someone burned it recently, probably late last night." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Meaning Albert, who went to the cinema, or Mrs. Lockett, who adores gossip, crept in after dark to dispose of their Blackmail correspondence?" Tuppence ignored the sarcasm. "It's more likely that someone slipped it in by mistake, or on purpose, perhaps thinking our grate a convenient crematorium." "Admirable deduction, Watson," Tommy said. "And your next move?" "Ask Mrs. Lockett," she declared. "And perhaps," she added meaningfully, "make a little call on Mrs. Denham." Before Tommy could reply, the telephone rang. He picked it up lazily, giving his usual Beresford residence. Then his expression changed. "Yes, this is Mr. Beresford. Who is speaking, please?" There was a pause, a strained, uneven breathing at the other end. A woman's voice came through, low and urgent. "Do you still have the letter?" Tommy frowned. "What letter?" "The letter. You must not destroy it. Please, listen." The line crackled violently and then a click. Silence. He replaced the receiver slowly. "Well, Tuppence, you win." She was standing very still, the half-burnt envelope between her fingers like a clue in a stage melodrama. A woman's voice? Yes, frightened, desperate. She said not to destroy the letter, and then the line cut off. Tuppence dropped the envelope onto the desk and folded her arms. "You may laugh at me if you like, but I tell you, this is serious." Tommy looked at her, and for the first time that morning there was no amusement in his eyes. "I'm not laughing," he said. "I've heard that tone before, none, the kind that comes before bodies in libraries." "Don't be silly. It's more likely to be a scandal than a murder. Still," she hesitated, "it's odd, isn't it, that she knew we had the letter?" Tommy nodded slowly. "Which suggests that she, or someone connected, placed it here." Tuppence began to pace again. "Mrs. Denham gave that dinner for a peculiar set of people. Remember that retired colonel who drank too much port? And that journalist who kept asking questions about the war years? And that woman with the pearls who looked terrified every time anyone mentioned the word fire? I remember that you said the soup was cold and the hostess distracted," said Tommy dryly. "Beyond that, my recollections are happy." She ignored him. Mrs. Denham was nervous that evening. Her hands shook when she poured coffee, and she kept glancing toward the library door as if expecting someone to appear. Tommy grinned faintly. "I thought she was admiring you." "Don't flatter me. It doesn't work. Something was wrong in that house." She leaned over the desk, smoothing the fragile paper. "I think Mrs. Denham wrote this, then panicked and tried to destroy it. Perhaps her husband found out. Perhaps she slipped it to someone, maybe even to me, without realizing, and now someone's terrified it still exists." "That's an impressive number of perhapses," said Tommy. "Suppose, instead of speculating, we have breakfast and think rationally." But Tuppence was already dialing the operator. "I'm going to ring Witchmere Court. If Mrs. Denham answers, we'll know at least she's alive." The line clicked, hummed, and a crisp female voice replied, "Witchmere Court." "This is Mrs. Beresford speaking. May I speak to Mrs. Denham, please?" A pause, then, "I'm afraid Mrs. Denham is not receiving visitors today." "Then I'll leave a message. I'm sorry, madam. Mrs. Denham is indisposed." The line went dead before Tuppence could demand an explanation. She replaced the receiver slowly. "Indisposed," she repeated. "That's country house code for something ghastly has happened and no one's talking." Tommy sighed, reaching for his hat. "And I suppose this means we're going to Witchmere Court." "Of course. One doesn't ignore a mysterious letter that refuses to burn and a frightened voice on the telephone." He regarded her affectionately. "You do realize we're supposed to be retired from sleuthing?" "Retirement," said Tuppence briskly, "is for people without curiosity." She slipped the envelope carefully into her handbag, snapped it shut, and marched toward the door. Tommy followed, muttering, "I shall never understand why we can't spend one weekend playing bridge like normal people." As he opened the front door, the postman appeared on the step, handing him the morning's letters. Among the usual bills and circulars lay one more envelope, cream, scented faintly of violets. Tuppence's eyes widened. "Well, well," she murmured, "it seems the past delivers itself by post these days." Tommy turned the envelope over. The flap was sealed with a blot of red wax, unmarked by initials, only a single pressed petal of violet trapped beneath. He met her gaze. "Do we open it now or after breakfast?" Tuppence smiled. "Tommy, when a mystery knocks twice before 9 o'clock, one doesn't stop for bacon and eggs." She broke the seal. The page inside was blank, completely, ominously blank, save for a watermark faintly visible in the paper, a delicate emblem of intertwined letters forming a word, Violet. Tuppence whispered it aloud, half to herself. Violet, Denham. Tommy looked toward the hearth where the earlier letter lay in its glass ashtray like an accusation. "You know," he said slowly, "I think that fire failed for a reason." And though the morning sun fell cheerfully across the carpet, both of them felt a small, unmistakable chill. The tyres crunched over gravel like faint applause as the Beresford's small motor turned through the gates of Witchmere Court. A light mist hung over the lawns, the kind that blurred the edges of the world, but couldn't quite hide its chill. Tommy glanced at the imposing facade ahead, tall windows, ivy like old handwriting creeping across the stone, and shutters closed on the upper floor. "Picturesque," he murmured, "if one likes houses that look as though they disapprove of visitors." Tuppence beside him tightened her scarf. "Nonsense. It's only a little unlived in. You could say the same of most marriages after 20 years, he grinned, "and yet we soldier on." "Because," said Tuppence briskly, "you never had the bad manners to own a manor house." A butler opened the great front door before they had a chance to knock. He was tall, grey, and faintly disdainful, as if the century had personally offended him. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, Mr. Denham is expecting you." "Is he indeed?" murmured Tuppence under her breath. She shot Tommy a look that meant so much for a surprise visit. They were shown into a drawing-room that smelled faintly of furniture polish and unease. A fire smouldered but gave no warmth. Portraits glared down from the panelled walls, ancestors with disapproving lips. A writing desk stood in the corner, its lid firmly locked, and on the hearth a few charred papers whispered as the draught stirred them. Before Tuppence could make a discreet approach toward the desk, a man entered the room. Mr. Denham was handsome in the way that photographs in society columns sometimes are, polished, distant, and faintly artificial. He smiled too readily, as though charm were a well-practiced trick. "My dear Mrs. Beresford, what a pleasant surprise," he said, extending a hand that trembled slightly before he controlled it. "And Mr. Beresford, always a delight. I had no idea we were to be honoured." Tuppence met his smile with one of her own, the kind that looked harmless but wasn't. "We happened to be in the area," she lied sweetly. "I was worried about Mrs. Denham. We heard she was indisposed." For the briefest instant something flitted across his face, fear or irritation. Then he laughed lightly. "A touch of nerves, nothing more. My wife has always been delicate. You know how these things are. Too many committees, too many invitations. She's resting upstairs." "How very wise," said Tuppence. "I always say a little rest can work miracles, especially after an unsettling letter." Denham's eyes sharpened. "Letter?" Tommy interjected smoothly. "My wife means that London is full of unsettling letters these days. Advertisements, demands for charitable donations and the like. One never knows what the post will bring." Denham relaxed visibly, though not completely. "Quite. The world's a tedious place for correspondence." Tuppence wandered casually toward the mantel, pretending to admire a clock. "You must find it difficult to keep up with social notes in a house this size. So many rooms, so many fires to feed." Her gaze flicked briefly to the half-burnt heap in the grate. Denham followed her eyes, then said lightly, "Ah, yes, my wife has a sentimental streak. She insists on burning old letters rather than throwing them away. It's rather poetic, don't you think?" "Very," said Tuppence, "almost too poetic." A small sound interrupted them, the clatter of a tray at the doorway. A young maid had entered with tea, her hands unsteady. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously from Denham to Tuppence. "Put it down, Alice," Denham said sharply. "You may go." "Yes, sir," the girl stammered. As she turned, the edge of her apron brushed the writing desk. The faint jingle of a key could be heard within. She froze for an instant, long enough for Tuppence to notice. When the maid had gone, Tuppence said lightly, "Pretty girl. She seems frightened of something." Denham's smile hardened. Servants always are. Fear is the only reliable quality one can employ. Tommy stirred. "That's a grim philosophy." Denham shrugged. "A practical one. Shall we have tea?" The conversation that followed was all surface, harmless topics polished smooth by civility. But beneath it, tension moved like a current. Tuppence asked about Mrs. Denham's charities. Denham replied vaguely. Tommy mentioned the weather. Denham insisted it was improving. Each word seemed to close a door rather than open one. At last, Tuppence rose. "We mustn't keep you, Mr. Denham. Give my regards to your wife. I do hope she feels better soon." Denham bowed slightly. "I will convey your kind message. And Mrs. Beresford—" He hesitated, then added with studied casualness, "If by chance you should come across any private correspondence of my wife's, anything at all, I would be grateful if you'd return it to me. Old misunderstandings, you see. Best not revived." Tuppence met his gaze steadily. "How thoughtful of you. But I assure you, if I find anything of interest, I shall treat it with the utmost discretion." Denham inclined his head. "Excellent." As the Beresfords made their way to the door, the butler reappeared like a ghost conjured by protocol. He led them down the long hall, their footsteps muffled on the Persian runner. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar, and from beyond it came a low murmur, a woman's voice pleading, quickly hushed. Tuppence slowed her pace, straining to listen, but the butler's presence loomed close behind, and she could do nothing but walk on. Outside, the air felt sharp and free. The car gleamed dully under the pale light, and the gravel crunched once more as they climbed in. "Well," said Tommy, starting the engine, "that was cosy." He might as well have shouted, "I'm hiding something in the study." Tuppence was still looking back at the house. "The maid," she said thoughtfully. "Alice. She wanted to speak. Did you see her lips? She said something, just as she turned away." "I was admiring the teapot," said Tommy. "What did she say?" Tuppence frowned. "There's someone else who knows. That's what it looked like." Tommy whistled. "Knows what?" "That," said Tuppence, "is what we're going to find out." They drove in silence for a while. The hedgerows blurred into streaks of green and grey. Behind them, Wychmere Court receded, but the feeling of being watched did not. Tommy adjusted the mirror absently. "You know, Tuppence, if you wanted excitement, we might have joined a circus instead. At least the elephants don't pretend to be polite." "Don't be flippant. Someone in that house is terrified. And Denham—" She paused. "He's charming, yes, but it's the kind of charm people use when they're trying to distract you." He nodded. "And Mrs. Denham?" "She's either too frightened to appear or forbidden to." The road turned sharply, winding between high trees. Tommy's eyes caught movement in the mirror, a dark shape, low and sleek, following at a distance. "Car behind us," he said quietly. "Black saloon. Been there since the gate." Tuppence turned slightly, pretending to adjust her scarf. The other car's headlights flashed once, then dipped out of view behind the curve. "Well," she murmured, "at least someone finds us interesting." Tommy accelerated slightly. "Let's give them something to follow." But the car behind kept its distance, never closing in, never falling back entirely. When they reached the crossroad where the signpost pointed toward London, the saloon turned the other way, vanishing into the trees. Tuppence exhaled. "We'll add that to the growing list of curiosities." "Which so far includes," Tommy counted on his fingers, "one frightened maid, one overcharming husband, one invisible wife, and one car that plays peekaboo." Tuppence smiled faintly. "It's shaping up rather nicely, don't you think?" "Too nicely," said Tommy. "That's what worries me." She leaned back, watching the clouds slide across the pale sky. "You know, Tommy, it's funny. Some houses feel alive, others, Wychmere, for instance, feel as though they're waiting for something, or someone." He gave her a sideways glance. "Waiting for us, perhaps?" "Possibly." Her tone was light, but her eyes were thoughtful. "Or waiting for the truth to come out, the kind that burns but never quite to ashes." The car sped on toward London, the wind rising softly through the open window. Behind them, the Manor's silhouette disappeared into distance, but the sense of unseen eyes lingered, as persistent as the faint scent of violets that still clung to Tuppence's gloves. The call came early, before breakfast, the hour when bad news likes to dress itself in understatement. Tommy was still shaving when Tuppence appeared in the doorway, holding the receiver slightly away from her ear as if it might bite. "It's the local constable," she said. "He wants to know whether we were at Wychmere Court yesterday." Tommy frowned at his reflection. "He's not here to thank us for social calls, I take it?" "No." Tuppence's voice was unusually quiet. "They found a body." By the time they reached Wychmere, the morning had settled into that deceptive brightness England does so well. Sunlight on grass, birds in cheerful denial, and something terrible underfoot. The river lay beyond the south lawn, narrow and slow-moving, its banks crowded with reeds that whispered as if conspiring. Two policemen stood near the water's edge. Between them lay the small, still form of a woman. Her cap had fallen off, pale hair straggled across her cheek. Tuppence recognized her at once. "It's the maid," she murmured. "Alice." Tommy's expression hardened, "the one who tried to warn us." Inspector Meadows turned at the sound of their voices. He was a square man, his hat tilted back, his manner brisk but not unkind. "Well, if it isn't the Beresfords. Thought you'd retired." Tuppence forced a smile. "We relapse occasionally." Meadows grunted. "Can't say I'm surprised to see you about. Trouble has a way of sniffing you out, doesn't it?" "Not as fast as you, Inspector," said Tommy. "What happened?" "She was found by one of the gardeners an hour ago," Meadows replied. "Face down in the shallows. No struggle marks, no signs of assault. Most likely suicide." Tuppence crouched beside the body, her eyes sharp. "Suicide?" she repeated softly. "Then why are her shoes clean?" Meadows blinked. "Come again." Tuppence pointed. No mud. The bank's soaked. Even I got my hem dirty coming down here. And her skirt's dry above the knees. She didn't walk into the water, Inspector. She was placed there. Meadows scratched his jaw. That's a bold claim, Mrs. Beresford. Not bold, she said, merely observant. Tommy leaned closer to the constable's notebook. Any idea when she died? Doctor says between midnight and 2. Tuppence's gaze moved to the girl's hands. One clenched, one open. In the open palm lay something fragile, almost invisible. She reached gently and lifted it with a handkerchief, a single violet petal, bruised but still fragrant. She looked at Tommy. Violets again. He nodded grimly. Our scent of choice, it seems. Meadows sighed. You two always did have a taste for symbolism. I suppose next you'll tell me this ties in with one of your mysteries. Tuppence folded the handkerchief carefully. I'd rather it didn't, but coincidences have a nasty sense of humour. From the slope above came the crunch of footsteps. Mr. Denham appeared, immaculate as ever, though his face was pale. Inspector Meadows, he said sharply, I must protest. My servants are distraught. Must this spectacle continue? Meadows gave him a measured look. Your maid's dead, sir. I'm afraid it must. Denham flinched, then drew himself up. I'll have my solicitor contact you. Alice was delicate, highly strung. I warned her about fanciful notions. Tuppence's eyes narrowed. Did you by any chance warn her last night? Denham turned coldly. Mrs. Beresford, your imagination does you credit, but this is hardly the time for insinuations. On the contrary, said Tuppence softly, it's precisely the time. Before Denham could reply, a woman's voice called faintly from the terrace. Gerald? Mrs. Denham was there, pale in a dressing gown, one hand gripping the balustrade as if it alone held her upright. Even from a distance, Tuppence could see the tremor in her fingers. Denham hurried up the bank, intercepting her before she could descend. Go inside, my dear. You mustn't upset yourself. I heard, she faltered. Alice? It was an accident, he said quickly. Nothing for you to worry about. Their words drifted down, but their faces said more. Mrs. Denham looked stricken, but not surprised. Denham's jaw was tight with something that wasn't grief. When they had gone, Meadows muttered, That man's nerves are all wrong. Tuppence agreed silently. Later that morning, the Beresfords walked to the village church. Its tower rose modestly over the cottages, and the vicarage next door smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. The Reverend Chalmers, a mild, bespectacled man with ink on his fingers, greeted them with weary politeness. I'm afraid it's a dreadful business, he said, shaking his head. Poor girl. She attended services here every Sunday, always seemed anxious. Tuppence studied him. Did she ever confide in you? The vicar hesitated. Not directly, but she once mentioned she'd seen something she shouldn't have, at the court. I urged her to speak to Mrs. Denham, but she only said, She already knows. Knows what? Asked Tommy. The vicar looked troubled. Mrs. Denham has been under great strain. There have been rumours. He lowered his voice. They say she's being blackmailed. Tuppence's gaze sharpened. By whom? I don't know, but it concerns her brother, Captain Ainsley. He died during the war. The official report said an accident, but the vicar hesitated again. There were whispers it wasn't so simple. Tommy leaned forward. What sort of whispers? That he found out something about the supply contracts, something dangerous, and then his plane went down during a routine flight. The vicar sighed. The war bred all manner of secrets, Mr. Beresford. Some didn't end when the fighting did. When they left the vicarage, the village seemed too peaceful for the things they had just heard. Children chased a hoop along the green, and the smell of bread drifted from the bakery. Yet beneath the calm, the air felt charged, as though the place itself was holding its breath. Back at the inn, Tommy ordered 2 cups of coffee. Blackmail, he said thoughtfully. It fits the tone of that letter, doesn't it? Tuppence nodded. And the timing. If Mrs. Denham's brother died in suspicious circumstances, someone might have used it to keep her silent. Silent about what, though? Smuggling, treason. She tapped the violet petal, now pressed between the pages of her notebook. Whatever it was, someone wanted it buried, literally. Tommy frowned. You think the maid knew something about the brother's death? Perhaps she overheard something, or found a letter, another letter. Tommy leaned back. You know, we could leave this to the police. We could, Tuppence agreed, but they'll file it under domestic tragedy, and the truth will stay politely dead. He sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. She smiled faintly. I'd hate to disappoint you. They drove back toward the river in the afternoon, under a sky gone faintly gold. The police had finished their work. The body was gone. The reeds stirred in the breeze. Tuppence walked along the bank, studying the footprints. Look here, she said suddenly. 2 sets, one large, one small. The small ones end at the edge. The larger ones turn back toward the trees. Tommy crouched beside her. So she wasn't alone after all. No, Tuppence straightened, and whoever was with her knew how to make it look tidy. A heron lifted off from the water with a cry that echoed down the bank. Tuppence watched it go, thoughtful. You know, Tommy, she said quietly, there's something cruel about a place that can look so beautiful while keeping its secrets. He gave a low whistle. You're getting poetic again. That's when I know trouble's close. Trouble, she said, has already arrived. We're just catching up to it. As they turned back to the car, a faint movement caught her eye, someone watching from the trees, a figure in dark clothing, motionless, half hidden. When Tommy called out, the shape withdrew into shadow. Tuppence's pulse quickened. That wasn't imagination. No, said Tommy. But it's confirmation. We're not the only ones digging where we shouldn't. They climbed into the motor, and as they drove away, the last glint of the river flickered behind them like a mirror closing. The scent of violets still clung faintly to Tuppence's gloves, a ghostly reminder that beauty could be as much a warning as a clue. And somewhere in the reeds, unseen by anyone, a small scrap of paper lifted in the breeze, half burnt, faintly inked, a remnant of a promise broken long ago. Dinner, said Tommy, glancing at the ornate invitation card, has never sounded so ominous. Tuppence stood at the mirror, fastening a string of pearls. You heard Meadows. He won't move until he's got something more substantial than my intuition, so we'll just have to find the substance ourselves. By gate-crashing Witchmere Court? Not gate-crashing, attending. Tea after Alice's death, the dinner was briefly postponed. I rang this morning to ask if it was going ahead. Mr. Denham accepted at once. That, my dear Tommy, is what the French call telling. He said, straightening his tie. I call it suicidal. She smiled sweetly. Then you'd better look your best for the afterlife. Witchmere Court looked deceptively serene as dusk settled, the kind of stillness that belongs more to paintings than to living homes. Inside, the dining room blazed with candles, their light reflected on silverware polished to military precision and on faces that smiled too much or too little. Tuppence, taking it all in with her habitual poise, noted the changes. There were fewer servants than before, and the air felt strained, as if each guest were counting the minutes until it was polite to leave. Denham greeted them with practised warmth. My dear Beresfords, how kind of you to come. I'm afraid my wife sends her apologies, still a little fatigued. She's fortunate to have you, Tuppence said smoothly. You seem to manage everything perfectly. The faintest flicker of guilt passed over his face. One does one's best. Tommy offered a neutral smile. A difficult week, I imagine. Quite, but one must keep up appearances. The phrase hung in the air longer than it should have. The guests were a curious assortment. On Denham's right sat Colonel Latham, square-jawed and leathery, the sort of man who gave orders even to his reflection. Next to him, a Mrs. Canfield, fragile, twittering, and perpetually spilling salt. Across the table, a journalist named Mr. Bryce talked too loudly and drank too quickly, while a clergyman, Reverend Chalmers's senior cousin, nodded at everything and contributed nothing. Tuppence, seated beside Mrs. Canfield, leaned in sympathetically as the older woman whispered, "So tragic about poor Alice. The river's so unpredictable, isn't it?" "Yes," said Tuppence softly, "especially when it behaves predictably." Mrs. Canfield blinked. "Oh?" "Bodies," said Tuppence matter-of-factly, "don't usually float face down unless someone helps them." The woman went white and busied herself with the salt cellar again. Across the table, Colonel Latham's voice cut through the murmur. "You've kept your cellar in good order, Denham. Not many can manage a decent claret these days." "War habits die hard," said Denham, raising his glass. "To old loyalties." There was a pause, the kind that exposes everything unspoken. Glasses were lifted, but Latham's stayed firmly on the table. "Not all loyalties age well," he said flatly. Bryce gave a forced laugh. "Come now, Colonel, don't spoil the toast. We're among friends." "Are we?" Latham's eyes met Denham's. "That depends on one's definition." The tension was almost audible, a creak in the air, a shift in posture. Denham's hand tightened on his wineglass. "I believe, Colonel, that loyalty is tested in adversity. Some of us passed." "And some," said Latham evenly, "cheated." It was Tuppence who broke the silence. "I always say wine tastes better after a good argument." Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, catching the fleeting exchange of glances between the journalist and Mrs. Canfield. Something passed between them, a signal, quick and deliberate. Moments later she saw Bryce receive something small under the tablecloth, a sealed envelope, slipped deftly by Mrs. Canfield's nervous hand. Dinner limped onward, roast pheasant, forced laughter, and the ticking of a clock somewhere beyond the double doors. Every subject seemed to end before it began. Tuppence made polite conversation, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the movement of that envelope. When dessert arrived, Denham excused himself for a few moments. His chair scraped the floor like a statement. "Perhaps he's gone to check on his wife," murmured Tommy. "Or to make sure no one else is writing letters," Tuppence replied. When Denham returned, his expression was calm, too calm. He resumed his place and raised his glass again. "I propose another toast," he said lightly, "to discretion, the last refuge of civilization." Latham grunted. "And of cowards." Denham smiled thinly. "We can't all afford bravery." The remark landed like a gauntlet, and again Tuppence saw that flicker of fear, not in Latham this time, but in Mrs. Canfield, who was twisting her napkin into a rope. After coffee, the guests drifted toward the drawing-room. The fire there was low, the curtains half-drawn. Conversation resumed in little clumps, the sound of glass and nervous laughter filling the gaps. Tuppence found herself near Bryce, who had taken up position beside the sideboard, refilling his glass under the guise of hospitality. "Journalists," she said conversationally, "always seem to know more than they print." Bryce looked startled, then smiled. "Professional hazard. One mustn't libel the living." "Or the dead," said Tuppence. "Poor Alice." He hesitated, glass midway to his lips. "Accidents happen." "Of course," she said lightly. "Though Inspector Meadows has such a suspicious nature, he's convinced she didn't fall." Bryce's eyes flickered. "Is he?" Tuppence smiled. "Oh, yes. He'll be asking questions, no doubt." Bryce swallowed hard. "Then he'll waste his time." "Perhaps." She tilted her head. "Unless he finds something worth keeping, like an envelope." Before he could reply, Denham's voice cut across the room. "Mrs. Beresford, you must see my library. Finest collection of Napoleonic volumes in the county." She turned gracefully. How could I resist? The library was a study in shadows, dark oak, heavy curtains, and the scent of old paper mingling with cigar smoke. Denham lit a lamp, revealing rows of leather spines and a mahogany desk polished to a mirror sheen. "You appreciate books, I believe?" he asked too casually. "Immensely. They're so much more reliable than people." Denham's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My wife's letters were full of your name, Mrs. Beresford. She seems to admire your independence." "Flattering," said Tuppence, "though admiration can be dangerous in some circles." He turned a page of a nearby ledger with deliberate care. "And curiosity, that's the most dangerous quality of all." She met his gaze. "Yet here we are, both guilty." For a moment, the silence stretched. Then the door opened and Bryce entered, flustered. "Forgive me, misplaced my cigarette case." Denham's expression tightened. "Then find it elsewhere." Bryce hesitated, then withdrew. Tuppence smiled faintly. "Your guests seem uneasy, Mr. Denham." "Uneasy people have guilty consciences." "Or fearful hosts," she said softly. He gave a short laugh. "You'd make an excellent spy, Mrs. Beresford." "I've been called worse." Later, when the guests were gathering their coats, Tuppence slipped back into the library under the pretext of retrieving her gloves. The fire was nearly out, the room half dark. She paused near the door as two voices drifted in, Bryce's and Latham's, low and fierce. "She's asking questions," Bryce hissed. "Then keep your mouth shut," said Latham. If she talks, we all hang. The silence that followed was thick with meaning. A chair creaked, a match flared, the smell of cigar smoke filled the air. Then footsteps retreated, the door clicked, and the house fell still again. Tuppence stepped forward, her heart quickening. The words echoed in her mind. If she talks, we all hang. She bent toward the desk. A faint trace of scent lingered on the blotter, sweet and unmistakable. Violets. She straightened, pocketed her gloves, and slipped quietly out. In the hallway, Tommy was waiting, coat over his arm. You took your time. I was admiring the decor, she said lightly. He looked at her face. Find anything interesting? Only proof, said Tuppence softly, that we've stopped being dinner guests. Outside, the night air was crisp, the gravel silvered by moonlight. Behind them, Wickmere Court stood silent, its windows black but watchful. Somewhere inside, a clock chimed 10, each note falling like a verdict. As they drove away, Tuppence sat back, eyes on the dark road ahead. Tommy, she said quietly, they're terrified, all of them. Of what? She opened her hand. In her palm lay a tiny scrap torn from an envelope, the faintest smear of violet wax still clinging to it. Of whatever they tried to burn, she said, and of whoever's still holding the match. The road to the past, Tommy reflected, was seldom well paved. Their motor hummed along the narrow lane leading out of Wickmere, the hedgerows closing in like silent witnesses. Tuppence sat beside him, notebook balanced on her knee, the morning sunlight catching the faint glint of her hairpin. An old airfield, she said, scanning the directions scribbled by the vicar. Closed since 45, officially decommissioned, which in government language means forgotten. Perfect place for secrets to rot, Tommy replied. Or to fester, she murmured. I prefer festering. It feels more human. They turned off the main road onto a rough track. Ahead stretched a wide expanse of grass, broken by a cracked runway and a row of derelict hangars slumped like old men too tired to stand. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust. Tommy parked beside a chain-link gate. Picturesque in a post-apocalyptic sort of way. Don't be flippant, said Tuppence. This is where Mrs. Denham's brother died. Allegedly. Officially, she corrected. There's a difference. They found the mechanic in a small corrugated shed near the far end of the field. A sign above the door read S. Brixham, motor repairs by appointment or miracle. He was wiry, with a face that had been weathered by wind and tobacco rather than time, and a limp that spoke of long familiarity with engines that bit back. He eyed them suspiciously as they approached. You're not ministry? He demanded. Good heavens, no, said Tuppence. We're much more dangerous. We're curious. He grunted. That's worse. Tommy showed him the letter of introduction from the vicar, though it was hardly necessary. Brixham snorted at the name. Ainsley. Now there's a good man who got a bad ending. You knew him? Asked Tuppence. Knew him, worked under him, owed him my hide, said Brixham, leaning against the doorframe. Captain Mark Ainsley wasn't the sort to look the other way, which is why they made sure he couldn't look at all. Tuppence's eyes narrowed. You mean his death wasn't an accident? Brixham spat neatly into the dust. Training accident, my foot. The plane went down because someone tampered with the fuel lines. And don't tell me about coincidences. He'd just told me that morning he'd found something filthy going on. Smuggling, theft, maybe worse. Said he'd be naming names by the end of the week. Did he tell you which names? Tommy asked. Brixham hesitated, then nodded toward a cluttered workbench inside. He wrote everything down. I've still got a copy of the letter. Didn't dare post it, not after the crash. You can read it if you promise not to quote me in your memoirs. We prefer mysteries to memoirs, said Tuppence. The mechanic rummaged through a tin box and pulled out a folded sheet of yellowed paper. Here, found it among his things after the fire. The handwriting was firm, deliberate, the kind of script that belongs to men who never expect to be silenced. Tuppence read aloud, her voice low. If I don't make it to London, remember this. Denham, Latham, and the woman who wore violets. They've turned our duty into profit, and our comrades into corpses. She stopped. The woman who wore violets, she repeated softly. Brixham nodded grimly. Never knew who he meant. Thought it was a code name, maybe, but he wasn't wrong about Denham and Latham. They were thick as thieves, literally. used their logistics network to divert supplies, fuel, parts, even medical kits, sold them to private buyers. Ainsley found out. "And then he died," said Tommy. Brixham met his gaze. "In a blaze bright enough to burn the truth." Tuppence folded the paper carefully. "May I keep this?" "You can take a copy," said Brixham. "I'd rather not tempt ghosts." "Ghosts don't frighten us," said Tuppence. "Then you haven't met the living ones," he muttered. They spent another hour at the airfield, piecing together details. Brixham showed them the hangar where Ainsley's aircraft had been stored, now half collapsed, the corrugated roof creaking in protest. On one wall, faint scorch marks still lingered, a memory of flame etched into metal. Tuppence ran her gloved fingers along the charred edge. 17 years, and it still smells of smoke. Tommy stood beside her. So Ainsley planned to expose Denham and Latham, and now both men are very much alive, and one woman is very much dead. "And Mrs. Denham," she said slowly, "is either the victim of their blackmail or the one holding the purse." Tommy glanced at her. "You're thinking she might be the woman with the violets?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps she knows who is. Either way, her husband's up to his neck in whatever this was." They walked back toward the car, the long grass whispering around their ankles. Tuppence turned once more toward the field, the empty hangars standing like sentinels. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how war doesn't end. It just changes its uniform." They set off for London just after 3. The sky had turned a pale, deceptive blue, the sort that promises peace and delivers mischief. Tuppence sat silent for most of the drive, the letter on her lap. Her thoughts ran in circles. Ainsley, violets, blackmail, Denham. The pattern was there, she could feel it, but the threads refused to knot. "Penny for your thoughts," said Tommy. "They're worth more than that. I think Ainsley's death wasn't merely to silence him. It was the foundation stone of the blackmail. Someone used it as leverage. The war provided opportunity, the aftermath, motive. Which still leaves us with the same problem," he said. "Who's the blackmailer and who's being blackmailed?" She looked at him sideways. "Oh, both, probably. These people seem to take turns." He chuckled, but it was cut short by a sudden sputter from the engine. The car gave a lurch, coughed twice, and began to lose speed. Tommy frowned. "That's not right." He pulled over, the motor wheezing in protest before dying completely. Tuppence climbed out, eyeing the road behind them. Empty. "Can you fix it?" "I can look intelligent beside it," he said, lifting the bonnet. "That's the limit of my mechanical skill." He peered inside. "Good Lord, someone's been at this." Tuppence joined him. "At what?" "The fuel line's been cut and clumsily patched. It's leaking. Whoever did this meant for it to fail after a few miles." "An accident waiting to happen," she murmured. "Or murder disguised as one," he said grimly. Tuppence glanced down the deserted lane. "Then someone knew we'd been to the airfield." Tommy straightened, wiping his hands. "Which means Brixham wasn't the only one watching us." A breeze stirred the grass. In the distance, a motorcar engine sounded faintly, then faded. "We'll have to walk to the next village," said Tommy. "It's 3 miles, give or take." Tuppence nodded. "And when we get there, we'll send for the car. But before that—" She opened the glove compartment and retrieved her handbag. "The letter copy stays with me." Tommy grinned faintly. "As if I'd dream of arguing." They started down the road, the air quiet except for the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. The afternoon light was thinning, casting long, uncertain shadows. After a while, Tuppence spoke. "If Ainsley wrote that letter before his death, then someone, Denham, Latham, or this mysterious Violet woman, made sure it disappeared. Perhaps they thought it had burned with him." "But Brixham kept a copy," said Tommy. "And now we have it." She nodded. "Which means someone will want it back." They reached the village just as the church clock struck 5. It was a sleepy place. A post office, a pub, a few cottages. The landlord at the Red Fox was friendly enough and offered to telephone for a mechanic from the next town. While Tommy handled the arrangements, Tuppence sat by the window watching the road. She couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Twice she thought she saw movement at the far end of the lane, but each time it was only a cart or a stray dog. Tommy joined her, handing her a glass of ginger beer. "Mechanic's on his way. Should be here in an hour." "Excellent," she said, though her eyes never left the window. "Do you believe in warnings?" Not of the supernatural variety. I was thinking of human ones, little reminders that we're getting close to something dangerous. He smiled wryly. Darling, in our line of work, danger sends flowers. Violets, perhaps, she said softly. He raised his glass. To ghosts of the war and the trouble they still cause. She clinked her glass lightly against his. To ghosts, and to catching them. By the time they returned to London that evening, their repaired motor gleaming faintly under the street lamps, the city's noise felt almost reassuring. People hurried along pavements, buses rattled past, and the faint smell of roasting chestnuts drifted from a corner stall. Yet beneath the ordinary hum of life, Tuppence sensed the undercurrent, the same as in Witchmere, the same as by the river. Secrets did not die, they only changed hands. As they turned into their street, Tommy said quietly, "If Ainsley named Denham, Latham, and a woman, we've already met two. The third must still be watching from the wings." Tuppence nodded slowly. "Yes, and she may not be wearing violets anymore, but she's still close enough to smell them." Tommy pulled up outside their building. "Meaning?" "Meaning," said Tuppence, gathering her bag, "that before this is over, we'll find out whether Mrs. Denham was the mourner or the murderer." They climbed the steps together, the lamplight glinting on the copied letter tucked safely in her handbag, and far off in the shadows across the street, a cigarette flared briefly before vanishing into darkness. London, Tuppence decided, always smelt faintly of secrets, of coal smoke, damp paper, and the perfume of women who had seen too much and spoken too little. 3 days had passed since the airfield, and in that time she'd read through Ainsley's letter a dozen times, searching its few words for meaning. The woman who wore violets. Now she had a lead, or rather, a scent. The tip had come from a small notice she'd unearthed in the wartime archives at the Ministry of Information. The Violet Club, a circle of ladies aiding correspondence with our fighting men abroad. Inquiries to Miss I. Harcourt, Secretary. "Sounds harmless enough," Tommy had said when she read it aloud that morning. "So did the Women's Institute," she replied, "until someone poisoned the jam." By early afternoon, Tuppence found herself in a narrow street in Kensington, outside a brick boarding house with lace curtains and an air of faded respectability. A brass plate read, "Mrs. Jarvis, Lodgings, Quiet Ladies Only." A maid showed her upstairs to a room that smelt of lavender polish and caution. Miss Harcourt sat by the window, thin as a question mark, knitting something indeterminate in grey wool. Her hair was neatly coiled, her eyes wary but not unkind. "Mrs. Beresford?" she asked in a voice that still carried the tones of finishing school long past. "You said on the telephone that you were researching a wartime organisation." "Yes, the Violet Club." The knitting needles paused. "Oh, my dear, that was a lifetime ago." Tuppence smiled gently. "Then you'll forgive me for disturbing your peace. I only wanted to understand what the club did. It sounds innocent." Miss Harcourt's smile was brittle. "It was meant to be. A few of us, officers' sisters, sweethearts, widows, writing letters to the boys overseas. Cheerful nonsense mostly. But things change in wartime. Innocence gets rationed." Tuppence took a seat. "And the violets?" "They were our badge," said Miss Harcourt, her gaze distant. "A way to recognise one another in stations, canteens, waiting rooms, a small silk violet pinned to the coat. The men called us the Violet Girls." "How many were you?" 8 to begin with. After the war, 5. Then 2 left England. 3. She trailed off. 3 disappeared. Tuppence's tone softened. "Miss Harcourt, may I show you something?" She drew from her handbag the scorched letter, the one that had started it all. Miss Harcourt leaned forward, peering through her spectacles. When she reached the line, "If you destroy this, it will destroy you," her face drained of colour. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "It was found in a fireplace. We believe it belonged to Mrs. Denham, formerly Miss Ainsley." Miss Harcourt's knitting slid to the floor. "Then it's begun again." "What has?" "The violets," she murmured. "They were a signal, not of friendship, of warning. One of us betrayed the others, Mrs. Beresford. The flowers meant danger. They meant silence." Tuppence leaned closer. "Who betrayed you?" Miss Harcourt's lips trembled. "We never knew, only that one of us was passing information, About shipments, troop movements, contacts. Ainsley found out. He told his sister. And then... Her hand jerked suddenly, knocking over the teacup beside her. Oh, clumsy of me. Tuppence reached to help, but Miss Harcourt was already pale, her fingers twitching. My tea, she gasped. It's bitter. Then she stiffened. The knitting chair creaked once as her head fell back, eyes staring at nothing. Tuppence froze. Miss Harcourt! There was no answer, only the faint rattle of the cup rolling on the floorboards. By the time Tommy arrived, summoned by a breathless telephone call, the room was a quiet tableau of tragedy. A doctor stood by the window, shaking his head. Poison, he said. Fast-acting. Possibly in the tea. Poor woman never had a chance. Tommy looked grimly at his wife. That makes 2 deaths linked to Violet's in a week. Tuppence nodded. And both women tried to talk before they died. The constable on duty was taking statements from the landlady. Mrs. Jarvis was a stout woman with red arms and an expression that mixed indignation with terror. It was her regular tea, she insisted. I make it myself every day at 3:30. Same pot, same milk jug, same leaves. No one touched it. Was she expecting visitors? Tuppence asked. Only you, madam. Tuppence's eyes met Tommy's. Then someone knew I was coming. When the police finally left, the Beresfords lingered. Tuppence began a quiet search of the room, moving with careful precision, as if afraid to disturb the ghost of conversation. She was frightened, she said softly. Even before the tea, she knew something would happen. Tommy examined the writing desk. Bills, knitting patterns, and, what's this? He pulled out a small black handbag from beneath a stack of magazines. Inside were a handkerchief, a few coins, and a folded slip of paper. Tuppence unfolded it, eyes narrowing. The paper was torn from a notebook, the writing hurried and uneven. D plus L equals fire. She read it aloud. D for Denham, L for Latham, and fire the crash. Tommy frowned. So Ainsley's suspicion was right. Those 2 were behind it. But what about the woman? The woman who wore violets, said Tuppence, gazing at the dead woman's still form. Maybe she didn't betray them. Maybe she punished them. They left the boarding house just before dusk. The street outside glowed with the golden half-light of evening, the lamplighter moving slowly from post to post. Tuppence drew her coat tighter. Someone poisoned Miss Harcourt minutes after I showed her the letter. They must have been watching. Tommy nodded. Which means this Violet Club wasn't just a charity circle. It was a front, and the wrong people joined. As they walked, a delivery boy on a bicycle nearly collided with them. A brown envelope fluttered from his bag, landing at Tuppence's feet. She bent to pick it up out of reflex, then froze. Stamped on the corner was a faint purple mark, the same embossed violet emblem she'd seen on Ainsley's stationery. Tommy glanced around sharply. Where did he come from? But the boy was already turning the corner, whistling innocently. Tuppence slipped the envelope into her bag without opening it. We'll look later, not in the street. Back at their flat, Albert, their long-suffering factotum from South Audley Mansions days, brought in tea and sandwiches. He regarded them with faint disapproval. I take it you're both once again courting trouble. Then I'll bring the strong blend, he said, leaving with dignity. When the door closed, Tuppence placed the brown envelope on the table. Shall we? Tommy nodded. Inside was a single sheet of cheap paper, typewritten. She wasn't the first, she won't be the last. D plus L must burn again. Tommy exhaled. So whoever sent this knows about the airfield too, and thinks fire solves everything. She tapped the paper. D plus L, Denham and Latham. But who wants them to burn again? A survivor of the Violet Club, Mrs. Denham herself. Or the mysterious woman who wore violets, said Tommy, still playing her game. Tuppence smiled faintly. If she's alive, she's clever and patient, traits I happen to admire. Remind me never to be your enemy, he said dryly. Later that night, Tuppence sat by the window looking out at the city. The street lamps glowed like patient eyes, and far away a church bell chimed midnight. Tommy was dozing on the sofa when she spoke suddenly. Tommy, there's something wrong with the arithmetic. He stirred. You've lost me already. D plus L equals fire, but someone else added the match. Denham and Latham may have planned the smuggling, but they didn't kill Ainsley. Someone did that for them, or to stop them. He sat up. And now that someone's cleaning up the rest. Exactly. Every time a woman talks about violets, she dies. Tommy gave a low whistle. Which means, my darling sleuth, you might want to avoid wearing perfume. I never rely on scent, said Tuppence calmly. Observation is far deadlier. She glanced again at the envelope on the table, its violet mark catching the light. This isn't over, she murmured. The war may have ended, but the battle's still going on. Only now the uniforms are silk and pearls. Tommy stretched, yawning. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, she said, we visit the ministry archives again and find out exactly who the members of the Violet Club were. Every one of them. He nodded. And then? She smiled, a spark of mischief in her eyes. Then, my dear Tommy, we'll see who's still wearing flowers. The knock came just after breakfast, firm, official, and not in the least apologetic. Inspector Meadows stood in the doorway, hat in hand, raincoat unbuttoned, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. His eyes flicked over the half-eaten toast, the typewriter on the table, and Tuppence's determined expression. I should have known, he said heavily, that when there's trouble, the Beresfords aren't far behind it. Tommy smiled. We're like the national anthem, turn up for every crisis. Don't joke, said Meadows. You're in deeper than you think. He glanced meaningfully at Tuppence. That boarding-house death, it wasn't suicide and it wasn't random. You've stirred something that reaches higher than I'm allowed to climb. Tuppence folded her arms. Then you'd better get longer ladders, Inspector. He ignored that. You're to leave it alone. That's not a request. Orders from above. Above what? Tommy asked. Parliament? The Archangel Gabriel? Meadows scowled. You think this is a game, but the war left rot in places we can't disinfect. Men who made fortunes when others bled. I'm warning you, for old time's sake, stay clear. He reached for his hat. I won't be able to pull you out next time. When he was gone, Tuppence stared at the door for a moment. When policemen tell me not to look, she said slowly, it's usually because they're afraid of what I'll find. Tommy sighed. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Only moderately. She turned to the typewriter, striking one key with a decisive click. D+L equals fire. We've got Denham, Latham, and a crash that killed Ainsley. The arithmetic fits, but not the motive. Why keep smuggling after the war ended? Greed doesn't demobilize, said Tommy, but we'll need proof. Then we'll find it. Her eyes gleamed. Tonight. That evening, the Denhams' house loomed once again at the end of its long drive, windows shuttered, the gravel pale under the moon. Tommy crouched behind a laurel hedge, whispering, We must stop meeting in shrubbery. It's unbecoming. Quiet, hissed Tuppence. You're the one who said he could manage a lock. I can, given time, tools, and the absence of an audience. Pretend you're on a mission, she said briskly. You were good at that once, he sighed. In those days I had a warrant. Still the lock yielded under his persuasion, and within moments they were inside, the back corridor of Witchmere Court, cool and silent. The air smelt faintly of polish and damp stone. Tuppence's voice was barely a breath. The study's this way. They moved along the corridor, the beam of Tommy's pocket torch slicing through darkness. The study door stood half open as though inviting them in. Inside, the room was much as Tuppence remembered. Dark oak, heavy drapes, the faint perfume of violets lingering in the air. On the desk lay ledgers and correspondence stacked with almost suspicious neatness. Tommy crossed to them, scanning the open page. Here we are, shipping manifests dated 46 and 47. Look at the names. Latham, whispered Tuppence, and Denham, joint signatories. Tommy turned another page. Ministry supplies diverted to civilian firms. Blank invoices, coded initials. This isn't post-war trading, it's organized theft. And the profits? He tapped a figure in the margin. Enough to buy a small country, or silence a large number of people. Tuppence's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece. A photograph stood there, a young officer in uniform smiling. Ainsley, she murmured. He must have seen these ledgers. Tommy nodded. And for that, he burned. A faint sound broke the stillness, the soft creak of a floorboard in the corridor. Tommy snapped the torch off. Someone's coming. They froze. Footsteps, cautious, light, approached the door. The knob turned slowly. Tuppence's hand tightened on Tommy's arm. The door opened wider. A figure stepped into the lamplight. Not Denham, but a woman. Her face was pale, eyes wide and exhausted. In her trembling hand she held a small revolver. "Mrs. Denham," Tuppence breathed. The woman started at the sound of her name, then seemed to steady herself. "I thought it might be him." Tommy raised his hand slightly. "If you mean your husband, we're not in league with him." She looked from one to the other, confusion giving way to despair. "You shouldn't have come. None of this concerns you." "It does when people die," said Tuppence quietly. "Alice, Miss Harcourt, they tried to tell the truth, and so did your brother." Mrs. Denham flinched as if struck. "Don't say his name." "But we must," Tuppence pressed. "He found out what your husband and Latham were doing, the smuggling, the profits. He tried to expose them." "You don't understand." The woman's voice broke. "Gerald didn't want Mark dead. He only wanted him silent. The crash was meant to frighten him, not—" She covered her face with one shaking hand. "They told me it would look like an accident. But when the plane caught fire—" Tommy stepped forward gently. "Who told you?" Mrs. Denham looked up. "Latham. He said it was too late to stop it, that if I spoke I'd be next." "Then the blackmail," began Tuppence. "Started later," said Mrs. Denham bitterly. "I tried to buy silence with the only thing I had left, money. But secrets don't stay bought." A sound interrupted them, a faint rustle like paper shifting. Tuppence turned. A draught stirred the curtains. On the desk, one of the ledgers had slid slightly, revealing a small metal tin beneath. Tommy reached for it. Evidence, perhaps. But before he could open it, Mrs. Denham's expression changed. She sniffed the air suddenly, eyes widening. "Do you smell it?" she whispered. Tuppence inhaled, a sharp, acrid scent beneath the perfume of violets. Smoke. Tommy turned toward the door. Good Lord! From the corridor, a dull glow began to spread. Orange flickers reflected against the polished floor. Somewhere beyond, flames crackled, gaining strength with terrifying speed. Mrs. Denham gasped. "The curtains! He's done it again! Latham, he said he'd burn everything if—" "Out!" Tommy barked. "Now!" He seized Tuppence's hand, pulling her toward the window, but the latch stuck. Smoke thickened, rolling low across the ceiling. Mrs. Denham stumbled, coughing. The servants stare through the pantry. They half-dragged, half-guided her down the passage. Behind them, glass shattered as the fire reached the study. The whoosh of igniting papers, the deep roar of oxygen feeding flame. At the foot of the narrow stairs, Tuppence caught her breath. "The ledgers! Leave them," Tommy snapped. "We'll be cooked along with the evidence." But Tuppence paused, glancing back. Through the rising smoke, she could just see the desk, half-consumed, and amid the ash a sheet fluttered free, one page not yet claimed by fire. She darted forward, snatched it and turned back just as the ceiling beam cracked overhead. Tommy swore softly, catching her by the waist as they stumbled through the kitchen and out into the night. They collapsed on the gravel outside, coughing, faces streaked with soot. Flames licked from the upper windows of Witchmere Court, painting the sky with infernal colour. The air was filled with the scent of burning paper and violets. Mrs. Denham crouched beside them, sobbing quietly. "He said he'd destroy it all. I thought he meant the ledgers, not the house." Tommy looked grim. "He's destroying the evidence, and you with it, if you'd stayed." Tuppence unfolded the half-burnt page she'd rescued. The handwriting was neat, unmistakable. Denham's. She read aloud between the charred edges. "Shipments. Latham arrangement. To be stored under cover of post-war relief." Her voice trailed off. "That's enough to hang both of them." Tommy nodded. If the rest hadn't turned to smoke. Mrs. Denham lifted her tear-streaked face. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "Gerald said it was business, that everyone did it. When Mark died, I should have gone to the police, but Latham—" A sound cut her off, the distant wail of a siren. Tommy rose, helping her up. "You'll have to come with us. When Meadows arrives, you'll tell him everything." She looked up at the burning house. "Everything's gone." "Not quite," said Tuppence. "Your brother's truth survived longer than his enemies expected." Mrs. Denham stared at the flames, her face lit orange and gold. "Do you think he'll forgive me?" Tuppence hesitated, then said softly, "I think he's waited long enough for someone to try." An hour later, They stood by the roadside as the fire brigade battled the blaze. The great house was now a skeleton of sparks and smoke, its windows shattered, its secrets burning away in bright confession. Meadows arrived, hat pulled low, expression grim. "I told you to stay clear." "We tried," said Tommy. "The fire insisted otherwise." He took the charred page from Tuppence's hand, studying it under the flashlight. "Well, well, Latham again. He's a slippery devil, but this—" He tapped the paper. "This might finally pin him down." Mrs. Denham sat in the back of the police motor, wrapped in a blanket, silent. Tuppence watched her, thoughtful. "She said Latham set the fire, but how? He couldn't have known we'd be inside." "Maybe he didn't care," said Tommy, "or maybe she wasn't supposed to come out alive." Meadows snapped his notebook shut. "If she lives to testify, maybe we'll get the truth. Though I'd wager there's another hand behind this, one we haven't seen yet." Tuppence nodded slowly. "The woman who wore violets." Meadows frowned. "Who?" "A ghost," said Tuppence quietly. "But she's still moving pieces on the board." She turned to watch as the flames subsided into smoke, the last embers glowing faintly against the dawn. Tommy slipped an arm around her shoulders. "Another cozy evening, eh?" She gave a tired smile. "You know me. I never could resist a little light reading by firelight." The letter arrived with the morning post, thick paper, black-edged, the kind that made the heart tighten before it was opened. Tuppence, in her dressing gown, poured coffee with one hand and examined it with the other. The handwriting across the envelope was unmistakably feminine, elegant, careful, and trembling at the edges. "Tommy," she said quietly, "it's from Mrs. Denham." He looked up from the paper. "I thought she was under police watch." "She was, which makes this." She slid a nail beneath the seal, either a miracle or a performance. Inside, the letter was brief and final. "I can no longer live with what I've done. The fire was mine to start, as was the lie that followed my brother's death. I confess to all of it, the theft, the deceit, the blackmail. Let the dead rest now and forgive me nothing." It was signed, shakily, Alice Denham. Tommy whistled. "That saves the Crown a lot of work." Tuppence didn't smile. "It's too perfect, too staged. People who truly mean to die rarely bother with elegant stationery." He sipped his coffee. "You think it's forged?" "I think," she said, tapping the paper, "that it was written for her, not by her." By noon they were back at Wychmere Court, now a ruin in repair. The fire brigade had done its work. The upper floors were blackened shells, but the lower rooms still smelled faintly of smoke and polish. Policemen moved through like ghosts in uniform. Inspector Meadows met them on the gravel drive, expression weary. "You're persistent, Mrs. Beresford." "I'm tidy-minded," said Tuppence. "Loose ends make me nervous." He sighed. "We've already been through the place. Nothing left but ashes and furniture with a grudge." She held up the letter. "Then perhaps you can explain why this turned up this morning." He read it quickly, frowning. "Posted from town. Hand-delivered to the sorting office last night. We assumed—" "That she killed herself?" said Tuppence. "How convenient." Meadows rubbed his jaw. "We found no body, but given the state of the fire—" "Don't," said Tuppence softly. "You'll only embarrass yourself. There's something wrong here, and I intend to find it before someone tidies it away." The drawing-room had escaped most of the blaze, though the once elegant wallpaper bore smoke stains like bruises. A faint smell of damp soot lingered beneath the scent of lavender oil, an attempt at civility over chaos. Tuppence crossed the carpet slowly, eyes on the ground. Then she stopped. "Tommy," she murmured. He joined her. "What is it?" She pointed. Beneath the grand piano, a faint trail of mud, thin, irregular, leading toward the door. "Those prints are fresh," she said. "And they're small. Women's shoes, not police boots." "Mrs. Denham's." Tuppence knelt to examine closer. "Or someone protecting her." She straightened. "If she wanted to disappear, this is the one house she'd never leave. Everyone assumes she's gone." "Clever," Tommy admitted. She moved toward the back of the house, following the faint scent of damp earth and something subtler. Sweetness, floral, hauntingly familiar. "Violets," she said under her breath. The trail ended at a pair of glass doors that led into the conservatory. The conservatory was half in ruins, panes cracked, soil scattered across marble tiles where flower pots had toppled during the fire. Yet among the chaos, some things had survived: the heavy air, rich with the scent of loam and moisture, and a small table set with 2 teacups. Tuppence froze. "Someone's been here recently." "Or still is," Tommy said quietly. From behind a row of fern planters came a sound, a faint gasp, the shuffle of a chair. Tuppence stepped forward. "Mrs. Denham?" A pause, then a rustle. Slowly, from the shadowed corner, a figure emerged. Alice Denham looked thinner, her once elegant suit smudged with ash, her hair unpinned and streaked with grey. But her eyes were alive, bright with both fear and defiance. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Tuppence didn't move. "So, it wasn't a suicide?" Mrs. Denham gave a brittle laugh. "If only it were that simple. He wants it to look that way, for everyone's sake." "He being Latham?" Tommy asked. She flinched at the name. "You know too much already. He's everywhere, even now. Money buys silence and obedience." "Then who helped you hide?" said Tuppence. The answer came from the doorway. "I did, madam." It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbons, a solid woman with sharp eyes and the posture of a general who'd long commanded her battlefield. She entered carrying a tray, calm as a churchwarden. "I found her near the river last night, half drowned and shaking. Couldn't let her go back to the police. She's been through enough." Tommy blinked. "You realise that's obstruction of justice?" Mrs. Gibbons sniffed. "I call it loyalty. Been with the family 30 years. I know the difference between a sinner and a scapegoat." Tuppence guided Mrs. Denham to a seat. "Start from the beginning," she said gently. "No speeches, just truth." Alice Denham closed her eyes. "After Mark died, I couldn't bear it. Gerald and Latham said it was an accident, but I knew. I knew Mark had found something, a shipment that didn't match the ledgers. He told me before his last flight that he'd uncovered a theft ring, war supplies diverted to private buyers." "Denham and Latham," said Tommy. She nodded. "Latham arranged the transport. Gerald financed it. And when Mark threatened to report them, Latham promised to handle it." Tuppence's voice was steady. "Handle it how?" Mrs. Denham's hands trembled. "By sabotaging the aircraft. But the fire was worse than planned. It spread to the hangar. Gerald was horrified, but Latham called it fate. He said it bound us together, guilt and profit. And he was right. Every year since, he sent me violets on the anniversary of the crash. No note, no name, just violets." Tuppence glanced around the conservatory, breathing in the faint floral sweetness. "So that scent wasn't sentiment, it was his warning." Mrs. Denham nodded, her voice breaking. "He said, if I ever spoke, he'd burn me out, just like Mark. And last week, he did." Tommy frowned. "The fire in your study, Latham set it." She looked up at him, eyes shining with exhausted certainty. "He must have. He was here that night. I heard him arguing with Gerald before I fled upstairs. When I came down again, the flames were already in the hall." Tuppence leaned forward. "And the confession letter?" "He wrote it," said Mrs. Denham bitterly. "Forced me to copy the words while he watched. He said it would spare everyone embarrassment. Then he left me alone, or so I thought. I ran. Mrs. Gibbons found me later by the lake." The housekeeper nodded. "Near froze to death, poor soul. I brought her here. No one looks in the conservatory these days. Thought it safest." Tuppence stood, pacing slowly among the ferns. "So Latham orchestrated everything. The smuggling, the crash, the blackmail, even your supposed confession. He's cleaning up after himself." Tommy said quietly, "And Meadows is chasing smoke while the fire starter walks free." Mrs. Denham covered her face. "He'll come again. He always does. He likes to see the damage." "Then we'll give him a performance worth watching," said Tuppence. Mrs. Gibbons frowned. "You mean to trap him?" Tuppence's smile was thin. "He's fond of staging scenes. Suicides, accidents, arson. Let's give him one of his own." Tommy groaned softly. "I was afraid you'd say that." They spent the next hour preparing, while Mrs. Denham rested and the housekeeper fetched coffee. The plan, as Tuppence laid it out, was simple enough. Mrs. Denham would remain hidden, while they sent word, through channels Latham was sure to read, that the police had recovered a surviving ledger from the fire. He won't resist coming to confirm it's gone, she said. Men like him can't bear unfinished business. And when he arrives? Tommy asked. Tuppence smiled faintly. We'll make sure the inspector happens to arrive too. Mrs. Denham looked up. Do you think it will work? It usually does, Tuppence said softly. Villains are remarkably predictable when their own lies turn on them. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted to a pale gold. Through the cracked glass roof, it fell over Mrs. Denham's face, softening the lines of fear that had etched themselves there. Mrs. Beresford, she said after a moment, why do you help me? You don't even know me. Tuppence hesitated. Because once upon a time, I was the woman who waited by the window for a man who might not come home, because war leaves debts that aren't written in ledgers, and because, frankly, I hate bullies. Mrs. Denham gave a small, wavering smile. Mark would have liked you. Tommy, from the doorway, said lightly, Everyone does at first. It's the second act that gets dangerous. Tuppence threw him a look, but didn't argue. When they finally left Witchmere Court that evening, the air had turned chill. The sun slipped behind the trees, and the first evening star glimmered faintly above the blackened chimneys. Tommy opened the car door for her. So, we bait the hook and hope our fish bites. Oh, he'll bite, said Tuppence, settling in. Men like Latham always do. He's built his life on control, and the moment it slips, he'll reach to snatch it back. That's when we'll have him. Tommy started the engine. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, she said, gazing back at the house. It's only the ending that's complicated. As the motor purred to life, she caught a final glimpse of the conservatory through the rear window, a faint glow where Mrs. Gibbons had lit a lamp for the hidden woman. The glass panes shimmered, reflecting both flame and darkness. Fire and lies, Tuppence murmured. And somewhere in between, truth, still breathing. The country air had a way of pretending nothing dreadful ever happened in England. By mid-morning, the lawns of Witchmere Court were alive again, not with firemen and policemen this time, but bunting, marquees, and ladies balancing trifles on porcelain plates. Never underestimate the English capacity for denial, Tuppence remarked, surveying the scene through her lorgnette. 2 deaths, 1 confession, and a blaze, yet here they are raffling fruit baskets. Tommy straightened his tie. Well, my dear, the tickets are for charity. Nothing cleanses sin quite like proceeds for the local orphanage. She smiled faintly. Or cover-up. The fete had been arranged in remarkable haste, apparently to restore community confidence. Officially, it was Mrs. Latham's idea. Unofficially, it was Colonel Latham's last attempt to appear blameless in public view. Witchmere's grounds, half repaired after the fire, were festooned with patriotic ribbons, as if to suggest that loyalty could still be manufactured in yards. Inspector Meadows lingered discreetly near the lemonade tent, pretending to study a tombola. "You're sure this will work?" he murmured when Tommy strolled by. "As sure as any plan devised by my wife," Tommy replied. "It's either brilliance or suicide." Tuppence made her entrance at 2:30, in pale blue linen, with a small white hat and a smile that could have sold state secrets. She carried a handbag slightly too large for fashion, and within it, folded to be easily visible, a replica of the infamous Blackmail letter. The ruse was simple. She would accidentally let slip that she possessed a second letter, one proving the crash had been sabotage, not accident. The hope was that Latham, ever the soldier of opportunity, would make his move. At precisely 3:00, she arranged herself near the tea tables, chatting brightly with a cluster of ladies discussing sponge recipes. "Such dreadful things, accidents," one murmured. "My husband says planes simply fall from the sky of their own accord." "How comforting," Tuppence said sweetly, "though I did hear that sometimes they fall with a little help." The ladies gasped, delighted and scandalized in equal measure. "You mean sabotage?" one whispered. Tuppence smiled. "Oh, I couldn't possibly say. But apparently a letter has surfaced, one naming names." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial hush. "I'm only keeping it safe until the inspector arrives." From across the lawn, Colonel Latham's head turned. His expression was polite, but his eyes, those cold, assessing eyes, fixed on her as a marksman's might on a moving target. Half an hour later, she slipped into the house through the French doors. The crowd outside was distracted by the raffle drawing. A small brass band struck up a rousing, if slightly uneven version of Rule Britannia. Inside, the house was cool and shadowed. She made her way toward the music room, where a single window cast soft light across the polished floor. Tommy waited in the adjoining study, hidden behind the half-open door. He could see her through the gap, calm, composed, pretending to examine the sheet music on the piano while her handbag rested in plain sight on a nearby chair. A minute passed. Then footsteps, firm, measured, military, echoed down the hall. Colonel Latham entered, his voice smooth as varnish. "Mrs. Beresford." She turned, all innocence. "Colonel, enjoying your fate?" He smiled tightly. "Immensely. You've made it rather more interesting." "Flattery, Colonel." He advanced a step. "Let's dispense with charm, shall we? I understand you found a letter." Tuppence's tone remained pleasant. "Such things do seem to find me." "May I see it?" "I'd rather you didn't." He laughed softly, a sound without warmth. "My dear lady, this isn't a request." He moved closer, his shadow falling over her. "Do you know what happens to people who meddle in other people's wars?" Tuppence lifted her chin. "Yes, they win them." His hand shot out, seizing her wrist. "Where is it?" Her handbag fell to the floor, the false letter slipping partly into view. He reached for it, and the door behind him burst open. "Let her go, Latham." Denham stood in the doorway, face pale, hands trembling. For the first time, the confident businessman looked human, frightened, furious, and desperate. Latham turned slowly. "Gerald, how punctual of you." "You fool," Denham hissed. "You've brought the police down on us. Meadows is here. This was your idea. The letters, the lies." "My idea?" Latham's laugh was sharp. "You profited just as much as I did. Don't grow a conscience now that the audience has arrived." Tuppence, still pinned by Latham's grip, said calmly, "If you gentlemen could settle your moral debate after releasing my arm, I'd be grateful." Neither moved. Denham stepped forward. "Let her go," I said. "Or what?" Denham's hand trembled at his side, a small pistol glinting in the light. "Or I'll end this here." Tommy, crouched behind the doorframe, tensed. Latham sneered. "You won't shoot. You never had the stomach for it, not even when your wife begged you to stop." The name struck Denham like a blow. "Leave her out of this." "Impossible," said Latham. "She was the best of us, the perfect accomplice." Denham's face twisted. "You made her one." He raised the gun. There was a scuffle, sudden, chaotic. Tuppence wrenched her wrist free, Latham lunged, Denham stumbled, and the weapon fired. The echo cracked through the house like lightning. Latham staggered back, one hand to his shoulder. The gun clattered to the floor. Tommy dashed forward. "Tuppence, are you hurt?" "Only my patience," she said briskly. "He has rather a strong grip for a traitor." Denham stood motionless, eyes fixed on Latham, who slumped against the piano, blood seeping through his sleeve. Meadows burst in with two constables. "What the devil?" Tuppence gestured elegantly. "The colonel has overplayed his hand." Latham looked up, his face ashen but his voice still smooth. "A pity. Such a tidy plan. Spoiled by amateurs." "Amateurs," said Tuppence, "tend to survive the final act." Meadows crouched beside him. "You're lucky it's not fatal. You'd best start explaining." Latham smiled faintly. "Explain? To whom? The law? The newspapers? They'll print what they're told." "Try me," said Meadows grimly. The colonel's eyes flicked toward Tuppence. "I never meant to kill the girl. She saw too much. The maid by the river. She overheard us talking about Ainsley's plane. She thought she could tell someone." His breath rattled. "I just wanted to frighten her, but she ran, slipped." "Save your breath," said Meadows. "You'll need it for the judge." Denham sank into a chair, head in his hands. "I should have stopped him years ago. When Mark died, I told myself it was done. But he never stopped. Not the blackmail, not the threats." Meadows straightened. "You'll both stand trial for obstruction, conspiracy, and manslaughter. That's lenient, considering." Denham nodded dully. "I won't contest it." Tuppence studied him quietly. "You might yet do one decent thing, Mr. Denham. Testify. Tell the court how it began, and why you let it continue." He met her eyes, defeated. "Because I was a coward, Mrs. Beresford, and because men like Latham make cowards of everyone they touch." Outside, the fete went on, oblivious. Children laughed, brass instruments played, and the raffle for the fruit basket was announced with cheerful fanfare. Tuppence watched through the French doors as a cluster of guests clapped politely, unaware that in the next room their host's empire had crumbled. Tommy joined her. "You're remarkably calm for a woman who's just been nearly throttled." "I've had worse grips from glove salesmen," she said dryly. "Besides, I expected as much. When you dangle bait, you mustn't complain when the fish bites." He smiled. "And what would you have done if I hadn't been lurking nearby?" "Oh, probably outwitted him with charm, or tripped him with my handbag." "Modesty as ever," he murmured. Meadows appeared behind them, hat in hand. "You know, Beresford, I could have you both charged with obstruction yourselves. Setting traps without police sanction." "Works rather well," interrupted Tuppence. "You should try it more often." Meadows sighed. "I'll settle for your statements in the morning." He turned to go, then paused. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you were right. About the letter, the fire, the maid. It all fits now." Tuppence nodded. "It usually does, once the wrong people stop talking." By dusk, the fete had dwindled to stragglers collecting bunting and half-eaten scones. Wickmere Court stood silent again, its windows dark. Tommy and Tuppence walked toward their car along the gravel drive. "Well," he said, "another day, another near-death experience." She smiled faintly. "Do you ever tire of them?" "Constantly." They reached the gate. Behind them a constable's voice echoed faintly. "Bring him out. Easy now." Tuppence turned once, watching as Latham was carried to the waiting motor, pale and rigid but still alive. "Do you think he'll talk?" Tommy asked. "Oh, eventually," said Tuppence. "Men like that always do, but only when they realise silence won't save them any more." She looked up at the evening sky, streaked with the last colour of sunset. "Funny," she said softly. "The war ended years ago, and yet the battles keep resurfacing. Different fronts, same casualties." Tommy took her hand. "Come along, darling. Leave ghosts to the historians." "Impossible," she said, smiling. "I collect them." He chuckled as they drove off, the faint scent of violets still lingering in the air behind them, a final trace of the Colonel's game, now played to its bitter end. Evening had drawn its calm curtain over the Beresford sitting room, soft and golden as old memory. The lamp by Tuppence's elbow burned low, the shade casting an amber circle upon the small cluttered table where the remnants of the day had come to rest. A teacup, a half-eaten biscuit, the evening paper folded at a story's end, and between them all, the letter that had started it. Tommy lay sprawled on the sofa in amiable exhaustion, one arm flung over his eyes. "So, my love," he murmured, "the villains are in custody, the police are moderately triumphant, and you have once again made enemies in high places. Are you content?" "Almost," said Tuppence. Her voice was thoughtful, not triumphant. "Only—" He peeked at her through his fingers. "Only what?" She turned the letter over once, twice. "Only that it doesn't quite fit. All the pieces line up, but the picture's wrong." Tommy groaned softly. "Darling, must we rearrange the jigsaw after the inspector's gone home?" "Yes," she said simply, "because there's one question no one has asked." He sighed. "Naturally." "Who actually wrote the letter?" "Mrs. Denham, surely. It was her paper, her house, her handwriting." Tuppence shook her head. "No, that's what we were supposed to think. But if this letter was the cause of everything, if it was the spark that lit all the fires, then why doesn't it accuse anyone directly? There's no demand for money, no threat, no name. Just one line. If you destroy this, it will destroy you." Tommy raised an eyebrow. Admittedly dramatic. "It's also protective," she said. "Not a threat, a warning. And that changes everything." She rose, moving to the bureau where her little magnifying glass lay, and held the letter under the lamplight. The scorched edges quivered faintly in the warmth. "Look," she said after a moment. "Here, at the top corner, barely visible." Tommy sat up. "What am I looking at?" "An embossed mark. The paper's thicker than ordinary stationery, good quality, military issue. And that emblem, see? A tiny wreath with a single flower pressed inside it." He frowned. "A violet?" She nodded. "The stationery of the Violet Club." Realization dawned slowly, like the first chime of an unseen clock. "Tuppence," he said softly. "You mean—" "It wasn't written by the blackmailer," she said. "It was written by Captain Mark Ainslie himself." She sat back, the letter held lightly between her fingers, her voice gaining quiet momentum as her mind raced ahead. He knew he was in danger. He must have discovered Denham and Latham's scheme and realized he couldn't trust the usual channels. So he wrote this, not a confession, not an accusation, but a message, a warning. If you destroy this, it will destroy you. Meaning, if the truth dies with me, you'll be consumed by it. Tommy let out a low whistle. And Mrs. Denham found it after his death. Yes, she recognized his handwriting, perhaps the scent of the violets. She must have kept it, not out of guilt, but love. And then, years later, someone else found it and mistook it for blackmail, or used it as such. The letter survived, he said, leaning back slowly, long enough to see justice done. Clever man, Ainslie. Clever and tragic, said Tuppence softly. He trusted the letter to speak when he no longer could. For a moment neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the mantel clock, marking the quiet triumph of time. Tommy broke it first. "Well, you've done it again, my dear. Solved a mystery that the police had neatly boxed up and tied with string." "I didn't solve it," she said. "He did. We merely listened." He smiled. "You and your ghosts." "They're rather good company," she said with a faint smile. He rose, stretching, and came to stand behind her chair, looking down at the letter. "So, what will you do with it?" "Finish it," she said. She struck a match, and for a moment the tiny flame trembled, a living heartbeat against the stillness. Then she touched it to the edge of the paper. The letter caught quickly, curling inwards, the writing vanishing in spirals of smoke. Tommy watched silently. "That's rather symbolic." "I like to think he'd approve," she said, eyes following the ashes as they drifted into the tray. "The truth's no longer in danger, and neither is she. He can rest now." "Not often you get to cremate a secret," he observed. She smiled. "It's very hygienic." Outside, a car horn sounded faintly from the square, a reminder that life, ordinary, untroubled, oblivious, continued as always. Tuppence sat back, hands folded neatly, the faint smell of burnt paper mingling with the scent of her jasmine perfume. "I was wrong, you know," she said at last. "About what?" "When we began. I thought this was a story of guilt, of people trapped by what they'd done. But it wasn't. It was about silence, about what people didn't say." Tommy tilted his head. "You're becoming philosophical." "Perhaps I'm tired." He reached down, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "You've earned it. For what it's worth, I think Captain Ainslie would thank you." "I don't need thanks," she said quietly. "Just sleep." They sat a little longer in companionable silence. Outside, the street lamp flickered, then steadied. A cat yawned somewhere in the courtyard below. Tuppence rose at last, went to the window and looked out into the gentle dark. "Do you remember," she said after a moment, "the first time we worked together? That silly little business of the missing pearls." "How could I forget? You nearly accused the bishop." "I was right about his wife, though," he laughed softly. "And now you've uncovered war crimes, blackmail and arson. You're moving up in the world." "Don't remind me," she said dryly. "Next time I'd prefer something involving stolen teacups." Tommy came to stand beside her. "Next time," he said, "we'll take a proper holiday. Somewhere with sea air and absolutely no violets." She smiled faintly, eyes on the faint reflection of the lamp behind them. "Sea air sounds lovely, but you know what they say, trouble travels first class." "Then we'll go third." "Economy doesn't suit you, Tommy." "True," he admitted cheerfully. "But then, neither does idleness." The clock chimed 10. Tuppence turned back to the table, where the ashes of the letter lay in a neat circle of grey. She brushed them lightly into the fireplace with one finger. "There," she said softly. "Now it's truly gone." Tommy regarded her with affection. "You realize, of course, that you've just destroyed the last piece of evidence in a national scandal." "Evidence of what?" she said, meeting his gaze. "Of a letter that no one wrote, warning of a crime already avenged. It served its purpose." He nodded. "And what do you suppose Meadows will say?" That he'll never understand me, she said, which is the safest thing for him. They both laughed then, quietly, contentedly. A few minutes later, as Tommy turned out the lamps, Tuppence lingered by the mantelpiece, watching the final flicker of the embers. In the faint glow, she thought she saw the ghost of ink across the last curl of paper, a single phrase vanishing into smoke. "If you destroy this, it will destroy you," she whispered. "Not this time." Tommy, half asleep already, mumbled from the sofa. "What was that?" "Just saying good night," she said. He smiled without opening his eyes. "To whom?" She looked again at the dying fire, its light soft on her face. "To the past." Then she crossed to him, drew the blanket over his shoulder, and switched off the lamp. The room fell into quiet darkness, warm and safe. Only the faint scent of violets lingered a moment longer, and then, like the letter itself, it was gone.